In this lesson, we'll talk about the basic component tray creation. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to create an extruded feature, apply an equal constraint, and apply a collinear constraint. The next thing that we need to focus on is creating a component tray. And since the last video, I've made some adjustments, so I want you to go ahead and upload the new file, xstar v35v14. Now that's version 35, which is where we ended in the designer section of our course. And we've done 14 versions in the engineer section. Now, if you choose not to go forward with this version of the file, here are some things that you need to know. So what I've done between the two versions is I've moved some components around. The batteries are still in the same location as of right now, but I've moved the ESCs so that they're sitting in a vertical orientation. I've tightened them up a little bit. I've moved the power distribution board back a little bit. I have moved everything up toward the top of the airframe, and I've also reoriented the transmitter receiver. All right, so you can see it's laying here on its side, and there are a few reasons why I've done all of this. You'll notice that the ESCs are switched in terms of their orientation. The three black wires that you see on the ESC model are the wires that are going to be going directly to the motors. The red and the black wires are going to be going directly to the power distribution board. Now, because the wires are going to the motors, it's important that we switch the orientation to make the wires as short as possible. The connector going from the transmitter receiver is going to be going from this black face into the side of our flight controller. On the back side, the pins are going to be the location for the wire that's coming out of our ESCs and going into the back of the flight controller. So each one of these ESCs is going to connect to the motor, the flight controller, and the power distribution board. So the way that this works out is we're going to have a lot of wires inside of this area that are going to be going from the power distribution board, whether it's going up to the flight controller, whether it's going out to the camera or out to the camera transmitter, going out to the ESCs, several different areas where we need to have wires either coming into this area or out of this area. So the orientation of everything right now is to keep that as clean as possible. One other thing I've also done is if you expand the xstar body, there is a new body called body 60, and this is the starting point for our component tray. Now the reason I wanted to start here is because it's a fairly simple representation, and the few things that I've done up to this point are things we've already covered in the course. I created a 40mm offset construction plane, and that was the starting point for the bottom face of the component tray. From there, I took the body bottom surface, I mirrored it across the midline, and I stitched it together. And that way I could take this simple profile I made and extrude it up to that surface. What this means is that the component tray is flat on the bottom from our 40mm offset plane, and it's going up to the bottom shape of our body. Now from here, I made a counter bore, and this counter bore is using the diameter of the head of the screw that I want to use. Now in our case, I'm going to be using a 5mm screw, and this is a little bit of clearance so that the head of a socket head cap screw can fit down into this recess. Now, of course, we haven't added any fillets or aren't any additional features just yet, and we do need to carry this out to the side of the airframe to add a bit more structure. But as of right now, all the components are sitting inside of here, and we're ready to start actually adding some of the details, some of the important aspects that I really want to focus on. So some of the things that we need to do, of course, are add details or features that can hold each of these components. And we're going to do that by getting started activating xstar component. Now, the reason we want to do this again is because the active component is where all of the new sketches and features are going to lie. If you combine bodies or if you create new bodies, we want to make sure that those are going to be inside of the xstar component. So from here, a few things that we want to do. We want to start by sketching on the bottom face of the inside of this component tray. Now I'm going to right click and I want to create a extrude. But you'll notice that as we look in here, we're going to create a sketch and we already have this profile. As soon as we select that face to create a sketch, it's going to bring that profile in for us to use. If I hide this body, you'll notice that the profile is shown there in a lighter color. So we actually have geometry there that we can use. And what I want to do is I want to just create a few small features to help hold components in place. Now, ideally, everything is going to have a nice place to sit, but in reality, things are going to have to move around a little bit. We might need to modify this once we make a 3D print. And these are the iterative things that we have to go through. The good part about this is that if we keep the mounting points the same, this part is going to be quite a bit smaller, and we can maybe print multiple iterations if we change, for instance, the flight controller or the power distribution board, or if we decide that a few things aren't working very well in here and we need to change the shape overall. Again, as long as we keep those mounting points the same and the underside shape of the airframe the same, we can just print a couple versions of this and test out ideas. So I'm going to get started by just simply drawing a few rectangles. Now, it's always a good idea to not go directly to the geometry that we have here in our models. Now, these are basic representations of the components that we're using. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a rectangle, and this rectangle is going to be used as a stopping point for, in this case, the receiver for my controller. You also remember that anytime you create geometry in here, that we're adding mass to the overall design. So while we could create a rectangle extrude that was this size, that would add a lot of extra mass or geometry that we don't need. If you want to fill in an area like this, it's a good idea to maybe make two smaller extrudes. If we make a secondary rectangle, this can have the same overall effect as having that one larger rectangle. So as we look at this, the first thing that I want to do is I want to create, again, just some geometry to help locate this part. So I'm going to take a rectangle coming off of the side down here, and this one actually has the line that comes out, and this is going to be our antenna. So we're going to have a spot in the side of this where we can have that cable pass out, and we can zip tie it underneath the airframe somewhere. So we're not going to do anything on this side. We're going to have a stop over here, and we're going to have a stop over here, and we'll probably add a secondary stop over here as well. So we'll drag this over and simply put it over here. Now at this stage, it's going to be important that we do a few things. We want to make sure again that we're not making this geometry too big or adding too much mass. So I'm going to start by dimensioning one of these, and I'm going to make this 3 millimeters thick, and I'm going to give it a dimension away from the wall of 5 millimeters, and then I'm going to dimension it from the corner, and I'm going to say 20 millimeters. Now again, we're not trying to touch the side of this component. We don't want to snap any references to it necessarily. It's certainly something we could do, but if we decide to move it after the fact, the references really won't matter because it's all based on where they fall in the timeline. Now at this stage, again, I just want some general spots inside of this case to help locate this component. Now this one over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this 3 millimeters, just like this end here. So I'm going to make those equal, and I can do that as well for this one. I'm just going to right click and I'm going to make them equal. I can then add additional constraints, such as making these two upper edges collinear, and I can also make their upper edges the same length by right clicking and making sure that they're equal. I'm going to go ahead and add a dimension to this. I'm going to make this one 5 millimeters long. And then I simply need to give it some dimensions. I'm going to call this one 20 millimeters, and then I'm going to dimension the distance between these two at 15, and I want to give this a dimension from the inside wall of 12 millimeters. So now we have those three rectangles fully defined. I'm going to go ahead and exit the sketch, and I want to extrude them. So I'm going to bring these three, I'm going to bring them up vertically, and I don't need to come up the whole way. The only wires on this specific unit are coming out of the top here, and then the one antenna wire. So I just want a little bit of a wall here that we can print just to give it a positive location. So we'll come up 10 millimeters and we'll join it with this body. Because we're creating a 3D print, we don't have to worry so much about some of the internal geometry being hard to manufacture. If we were to machine this, we wouldn't be able to cut these sharp corners on this edge or this edge. we couldn't get a round cutting tool in here to cut that geometry. Now, these external corners would be fine, but this type of geometry is perfectly fine if we're creating a 3D print. So now that we understand the process, I'm going to carry on this by saving our file and move on to the next step, adding a bit more of this detail to hold our components.